We are live. All right. It's that time of the week again, DeFi Friday. I'm Alfred here from DiversiFi Capital. Almost got my company name wrong.
All good.
I'm ready. I think I'm ready for the weekend. That's probably what it is. Again, my name is Alfred. It's DeFi Friday. We're going to be talking about credit cards and debit cards. What's the comparison between the two? Which one we should use? We'll get to that in 1 second. But at the beginning of the show, I always ask Raymond how he's doing. Raymond, how are you?
Doing good. Happy to be on the show again. Once again, it represents a Friday. It's been super nice weather recently, so hopefully everybody's
Oh
enjoying it as
man,
well. Yeah.
I haven't moved. I've been inside, so I haven't enjoyed any of the weather, but I hope to be doing that soon,
Definitely.
getting out there. But yeah, it is spring. I think I'm starting to enjoy that daylight savings time, even though with the
Sure.
2.5-year-old, I think initially it's a little weird with the sleeping schedule, but I am enjoying when we get off work, there's some sunlight out, right? But
For sure.
what do we got? Got the market.
Mhm.
Still trying to decide whether inflation is going to be an issue or not. We'll get into that in a second. And then we got a bunch of questions, right? About like, hey, like, how should I be thinking about spending? We did do a show a little while back about
Mhm.
the top budgeting apps to be using, and we covered that a little bit there. But we're going to tackle specifically today, whether someone should be using credit cards versus right debit cards. So, what are the pros and cons? What are some pitfalls? How do you think about debt overall? Okay. But we're going to jump into it. We're going to jump into talking about the stock market and what we're seeing in just a second. But just remember, anytime we're on these shows and we're talking about these things, it's for an education purpose, right? We're not trying to help with personal financial advice right now. There's a place for that, right? DiversiFiCapital.com. Click
Mhm.
on our Get Started side and learn how we're trying to change a little bit of how the financial industry is working and providing advice in more of an education focused consultations. Okay. Also, if we're talking about investments, we're not soliciting you to be buying any specific investment products, right? We're just talking about the general market conditions overall. And then finally, right, from a legal and from a tax perspective, we're not acting as your professional there. Those questions should be directed back to them. But another week, and I think one of those things is understanding how the market is trying to decide back and forth between whether or not this worry about inflation, right, is going to truly impact, right, where the stock market is going, right? So we are seeing some of that. We've already talked about in our previous show how interest rates going up can affect growth stocks like NASDAQ. And is that what you're seeing still this week, Raymond? Is that what you're seeing in terms of what the market data is showing you?
Yeah, so I mean, just to give an update on this week's past performance, we have Nasdaq lagging amongst this S&P 500 and Dow Jones. So this past week they're actually down 0.58%, whereas the leading this week was S&P 500 at 1.57%, and then Dow Jones at 1.36% positive, right? So Nasdaq was the only one that was lagging this week, so definitely still seeing some concerns around there. Even today, we did see the market climb a little bit further towards the end of the day, really because of the core inflation that we're seeing within the U.S. isn't as mild as people were thinking it to be. So we
Mhm.
definitely saw some of the climb back there. And we did also receive jobs data this week as well in terms of unemployment being issued out there. So that's at one of the lows as well. So definitely pointing towards a recovery, right, for the economy. So that's definitely some good signs there.
Yeah. And what's interesting is like, I've gotten questions about like is inflation bad or is it, growing interest rates bad? I think the idea is like why is it growing, right? Like
Mhm.
why is inflation growing? Is it because economy is projected to look really good, right? Things are growing, GDP is growing, and so that may not be a bad reason, right, for inflation to happen,
Sure.
because there is healthy, right, growth rates. But I think it's not just inflation growing. It's the rate that they're concerned about, that they're worried about the rate of inflation growing could be drastic. And that was reflective of the US, right, 10-year treasury rates going from, I think beginning of the year was like 0.9, and then now it's right 1.6%. It was a quick increase there.
Mhm.
Right now, I think this week, I think Powell, right, Jay Powell was saying that inflation is still soft, right? So maybe calming a little bit of the worries, right? That the Federal Reserve, the U.S. Federal Reserve, would still very much stick to their guns and their current policy of keeping rates low, right? So that, I think, Raymond, led to a uptick just today, right, into the close of the market, where things rallied a little bit.
Exactly.
Right. And so, I think for now, right, one of the things that we're still watching is, as we think about inflation, people will relate to like real world items to like what inflation looks like. So for example, like oil prices are hitting highs, right? And so people are worried that's a sign of inflation, right? You have commodities like copper hitting a 10-year high, right? But the consumer inflationary indices haven't quite changed just yet, right? And so I think that's where that disconnect is between who's right or who should you believe about where rates and inflation is going to go. So because of all this kind of debate still on who to trust, on what the numbers truly look like, you have a market, I think, that's trying to, adjust itself or trying to find its own direction of which way it's going to go. So kind of moves sideways, right? NASDAQ flat, 1.5% on the Dow, right? Or 1.3 on the Dow, 1.5 on S&P, kind of trading sideways a little bit. So it'll be interesting to see what new data points are going to drive this. And that happens sometimes when the market trades sideways for a little bit. You get 1 or 2 or 3 data points that really pushes one way or another, and then you could see the spike or adjustment, right? So we're kind of waiting for that at the moment. Okay. Anything that has, in your mind, seen like some bounce back, right? Any sectors that you're seeing some bounce back, this year?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel like a lot of the sectors that got hit really hard last year because of the pandemic, more like cyclical, like energies, industrial sectors that we saw, are actually the strongest performers this year, year to date. So starting to see some of the comeback there that we were expecting.
Cool. All right. So, as markets change, hopefully we continue to bring, more of what we're seeing to you guys. For now, again, because it's trading sideways, a lot of the same stories that we're still seeing: inflation, right? Opening up of economies, vaccines across many states. We didn't talk about that. We didn't bring that up, but yeah, like, that could be something, at least in California, right? Opening up to everyone to schedule theirs by April 15th, right? So the light is shining a little bit brighter for what's at the end here, right?
Definitely.
All right. So I think in our Instagram, we posted, right, about this topic, and we said, cut up the plastic, right? And when we're talking about credit cards versus debit cards. Okay. So, right, we talked again a little bit about this in our prior shows, where we said, what's a good way to track your budget and using the app. So you may want to go back to that show when we talked about the top apps to track your budget with. But today is more about how you spend. Okay. Not about being aware of necessarily like the exact budget numbers, but like the method of which we are spending. Is it a credit card or is it a debit card? What are the pros and cons? Okay. But first, start with like, Raymond, why is there some inherent fear, I think, for a lot of people to use credit cards? Like, why are people afraid to use it? What's some of the main reasons?
Yeah, because I feel like with the credit cards, you are borrowing money from the credit card company to spend. And if you're unable to pay off the full amount that you're borrowing, then there's going to be interest charged on the amount, right? So it's definitely unnecessary charges, but it allows somebody to maybe apply for a credit card, possibly get like $5,000-$10,000 limit on the credit card and go out there and spend, right, that amount that is eligible to them. So
Yeah.
Sometimes it takes away their ability to know, like, hey, I need to stay within a certain means, because that's not what the credit card companies care about, right? They want to just collect their funds when you borrow it, and if you don't pay it back in full, then there's going to be the interest that you have to be responsible for at that point.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, like when you're talking about like understanding why something is created, credit cards were not created just to be able to give you money so you can pay it off, right? Credit cards with credit card companies are created so that, right, in a way, if you don't pay them back, you owe them 30+% interest. I mean, that's one way they generate revenues, right? But of course, transactions themselves, right? I mean, that's a whole different story about how credit card companies make money. But right, from a consumer standpoint, yeah, I mean, so many people, right, accrue credit card debt, right? And that's why people get afraid. Like, I think a lot of maybe my parents' generation or your parents' generation, Raymond, they don't like debt. They're like, pay with cash. right? Why are you using money that you don't have?
Yep.
Well, I mean, for me, right, and we joke about this, right? It's free money or whatever. No, it's not free money, but you always have to think about what could your money be doing, right? If you're spending something and you don't have the money, please don't use the credit card, okay? Like that's not what we're speaking to, right? Like you don't, if you have $0 in the bank account and you have a 5,000 credit card limit and you have no way of understanding how you pay off the credit card, don't use the credit card. Please stick with the debit card, stick with what you have, and make sure you can control your budget. Because the issue there isn't credit card versus debit card at that point, right? The issue there is we're spending beyond our means, right, in terms of what we're bringing in, right, versus what we're actually spending. And people call that like a net zero budget, being able to at least break even. Okay. But this conversation is about the advantages or disadvantages of using a credit card or using, right, debit card.
Yep.
And I think from my perspective, and when we talk to clients, it's like relative to, and this is for debt in general, okay? For debt in general, relative to what you're borrowing money for. So unlike credit card where it's short term, if you're borrowing money for a mortgage or a car or certain things, when we were just talking about, Raymond, how low interest rates were,
True.
then you have to argue relative to what money I would have put down because A, I can pay for it, right? Or the client can pay for it. I'm choosing to say, should I pay it down so I don't incur this, loan where the money just then now sits in this asset or car or house and it's just stuck there, right? It grows in a certain manner, but if I can keep that money by leveraging a loan and that loan is in the stock market making the percentages that we quote sometimes, right? You might be better off over the long term by doing that, right? So that's why debt can be good. Right? In this case, though, right, it's understanding from a credit card's perspective, as long as we can pay it off each month, right? How are we able to utilize a credit card to then better track my finances? How do I use it to consolidate what I'm spending, right? Because if I'm talking about all of this and you are still not right now aware of where your spending is, but you know that you are above a net zero budget, meaning you know that you make more money than you spend, but you just don't feel like you have an awareness about what you're spending, then this conversation is for you, right? So tell us a little bit about, we've talked about why people are afraid of credit cards, right, Raymond? But what is the positive side of using a credit card?
Yeah, I feel like, a lot of things that's been driving people to use credit cards has really been the rewards, right? The rewards that people are getting, whether from flying or using hotels or points that these companies or these are trying to get you into using their credit cards, right? Whether it's shopping or whether it's traveling, like traveling is probably one of the bigger ones. But rewards is a really big thing, getting 3% back on gas purchases, 2% on dining out, 1% on everything else. That's something that you wouldn't get, right, if you were paying in cash, or even sometimes I just don't see that many rewards through debits, if at all, right? So that's really a big pros of it. Tracking purposes as well. When you are able to pay on a credit card, you know how much you paid to that company, whether it's shopping or dining out. So it allows you to categorize where those funds went through that credit card. And then we'll talk more about the safety, right, between credit card spending versus a debit card spending instead. But those are some pros there. And of course, you need credit to also build your credit score too, which we had taught in previous videos and webinars.
Cash, right? We were just saying that. I'm showing you cash. I don't know that I've ever touched this cash. It's like an emergency thing where I'm trying not to touch. In fact, through the pandemic, I'm actually trying to get rid of even how many credit cards I hold in my wallet because they're more taking Apple Pay now. But to your point, cash is difficult because you can't track, right, where the money went months later. The argument for people using cash is like, if you put $20 in your pocket, $30 in your pocket, and this is what you have to spend, you try to keep within that. I think I agree with that for someone who's trying to really be budget aware and getting down to that net zero budget, and they need to make sure that they're not spending a dollar more than they don't have. I get that. But when you're above net zero budget, all of a sudden you're in a situation where you're trying to be efficient in how you track your budget, right? You're not necessarily worried about the payoff of it. And that's where I think the credit card can be really helpful. So to summarize what Raymond said, right? It's the tracking. Like it's literally when you swipe your card, it's a 24-hour tracking system now that you've created by logging into your account, or some of these apps that you can overlay to track multiple credit cards to see how much was the expenses from your credit cards last month. Log in, make sure it's synced, you can see it. Okay. If your budgeting system isn't something that you can find that it takes you 5 minutes to be able to know what you spent last month, and it's probably not a very good budgeting system, right? You should probably try to find a new one. Anything more than that, it just feels like it's too difficult. Okay.
Yep.
The points are definitely one of them, right? And being able to now consolidate almost everything that you can spend on a credit card onto the actual credit card itself also limits what goes on the debit card. So why do we want to limit, Raymond, what goes on the debit card? Is there like a security issue, and a tracking issue?
Yeah, so at least on a debit card, and if you are using debit, they're still going to keep track of your expenses because you charge it. But really, from the safety perspective of it, I'm not sure if the viewers ever, lost credit cards. Usually you would give a call in. They'll ask you like, what is the last transaction that you remember? You will let them know, and they'll just erase everything at that point and issue a brand new credit card, right? So really, the burden of proof of the credit card being lost and being used is going to be on the credit card to prove that it wasn't you. Whereas on the other end, if it was a debit card that was stolen and utilized, that's going to be cash that's taken directly from your checking account, right? So it is cash that's drawn automatically, in which case it happened to me before where people were taking out small deductions from there. I didn't catch it until like a few weeks later on. And when I actually called my bank companies, let them know like, hey, that wasn't me. I'm not in Arizona. They had to ask me to prove that I was not in Arizona during that time. So proof of burden was actually on me to prove to them that I did not pull out money, I didn't spend it. So that whole process probably took somewhere between 2, 3, 4 weeks to actually see that money come back into my bank account, right? So that can be really scary, right? If they actually spent more, or if you were depending on that money for rent, for example, and it just takes weeks for it to come back to you. So at least from a safety issue here, we've definitely found that credit cards are safer, in which case you're always able to, you're still borrowing from them initially, and they'll be able to wipe off, what wasn't yours that you had spent.
Yeah, and I think that would concern me if I had a Visa logo or some logo where you can use it as a credit card, from your debit card, but use it as a credit card. The money comes from your checking account, right? And if that's where my majority of my funds are, that's not invested, that's a scary thing to say that they could drain that account, right? I think that was my main driver when I first thought about this, of why I don't want my debit card really to be used very often. In fact, you can actually call your bank and say, I actually want a debit card with no Visa logo on it. They can actually take the Visa logo off, or MasterCard, whatever the actual transactional logo is, off. And you then you have to have a PIN to make sure you use it. Whereas it's like you can, otherwise having that logo will allow you to use it like a credit card, right? And so I have that removed from my card. But yeah, I mean, if you boil down to the fears of using a credit card, right? I think it is this idea that, right, like I'm spending money that I don't have. And I completely understand where that fear comes from. But the solution to that is not using a debit card, right? Necessarily. That might be a short-term solution, but it still makes it, again, hard to say, especially if you're trying to save and you're constantly spending down. Remember, all of a sudden, your mind of reference in your checking account is what I have left over, right? If I have normally $2,000 left over in the account and I'm not really tracking my spending, my mind would say, hey, you know what? This month I have 2,000. Last month I had 2,000. That means my spending is fine. Yet you might not realize maybe you received more income or your salary is growing. Guess what? At that point, if you're just tracking that your checking account is still at $2,000, all of a sudden your expenses would have grown and you won't have even known, right? And that's the danger of some of that, okay? So once you get to a point where you're coming into this and you're asking the questions of how do I be efficient, right, with tracking and knowing what my expenses are, then I really think that you should consider a system where you're using one credit card or a couple credit cards that gives you good rewards as a side benefit, but the main benefit being that it allows you to see all your transactions in one place. And it might scare you, right? It might actually scare you a little bit to say, wow, I spent how much last month, right? Because you put it on one credit card, it's visually there to kind of do a sanity check, right? Of, am I doing the right things? Am I making the right money decisions? Here's another pro tip. you can actually change the statement date of your credit card, right? So what does that do, Raymond? Like if I'm changing the statement date of the credit card to match to maybe the months, how does that help me even further?
Yeah, so I mean, just to keep things consistent with maybe like your paycheck that you're receiving, if it's every single month, right, it allows you to really track what happens during the first until the end of the month, right?
Yep.
There are some credit cards, once you open them, it's automatically the 15th or the 17th. They all have different dates, but you are able to call in and ask them to change it from, hey, I just want it from the 1st to the 30th. So that way it captures any bills that you might have, anything that you might occur during that 30-day period for each month. So I think it's better to get things that way and get a little more consistent with your expenses than check against your credit card.
Yeah, it's about making the things that you do day to day work for you, right? People say, yeah, make your investments work for you. You can make your credit card statement work for you, right? If it's on some random day that Raymond was saying that was initially set up, that it's not going to give you any information. But if you set it up to be closing on the first of each month, that statement represented what your monthly transactions were. Right now, you might pay that 20 days later. So the payment date is, again, less relevant because I'm already making the assumption that you can pay off the credit card bill to be able to use this system. But if you now have that statement close on the first of each month, now every time you see the statement, whether you make a payment, right, it reminds you how much you spent last month and could coincide with what you're trying to do with your budget, setting the right numbers, and then ultimately knowing if that's the number that I'm trying to track and the number on my debit card side is fairly fixed, it could be rent, it could be some fixed cost, you can easily add those two numbers up to understand what your total budget looks like. You take that away from your income that you get every month and you get a better idea of what you can save, right? And that's what then starts to make good financial decisions to be able to help you build your investment accounts, right? Save towards a particular goal, right? So it all starts from these little things and little changes that someone can make to bring a lot more awareness, not only to their budget, but in this case, how you're spending, right? How you're spending.
There's actually one additional tip for credit cards that I like to reference to my clients and even for myself. I just feel like, our generation, there has been Venmo, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it was pre-COVID, it was so easy just to transfer, I'm gonna Venmo you this, I'm gonna front the lunch for you, I'm gonna front the Airbnb for you, people Venmo you back. And that can get really confusing for your transactions, right? Because now you spent $2,000 in an Airbnb for everybody, but now it's coming up within your Venmo, right? So how I found things have worked, if you're trying to keep track of your credit card spending, like truly your spending, it will be just that once you receive those Venmo transactions, just pay off your credit card right away. So there's no penalties for you to pay off your credit card during that month you're spending. You can always prepay it, but at least paying off what you received from your Venmo will offset what you had initially charged on your credit card and just leave whatever you actually spent on that vacation or for that lunch or dinner, right? So, I felt like that was a very common thing that we would see from our clients and even from ourselves. And I think that's a good way to offset that charge that we have on there and really see what our end of the month spending is.
Yeah, and it keeps that statement again working for you, right? That end of the month statement with that paid off, that statement would still show the net total of what you spent.
Exactly.
Again, to add to that, those platforms like a Mint, right, .com, which is something that I personally use. You can go in and the app itself is good, but the website is actually a lot better because you can actually see a bunch of the trends in there and you can click on all your credit cards and then offset those transactions that you were saying by just looking at the credit cards and saying, hey, I got reimbursed for this. But that's another way. Yours, of course, actually, I don't think you've ever told me that. Why are you holding that pro tip from me, man? Right. And so I might have to try that now. It makes sense, right? Paying that off, keeping your credit card consistent at the end of the month, and again, keeping all the things that we're talking about an apples to apples comparison.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Sounds good, guys. Hey, well, thank you again for joining us. We've got a little bit more of a time relevant topic next week. We're going to be talking about the idea of wanting to deduct expenses that you had during a COVID year last year when you were working from home. That is a really popular question right now because of tax time coming up, which, by the way, got moved over to next month, right? And so, next month, May, right? And so, but we're going to bring this topic to you to talk a bit about how to understand Is it even possible to deduct things as expenses if you worked from home? Who is that possible for? Does it matter what state you're in, right? So we're going to touch upon that next week at 3 p.m. Pacific. All right. Thank you, Raymond, for joining me. Happy Friday.
Yeah.
We got a happy hour later, I know, as a team. So I look forward to seeing you then. But for our audience, we look forward to seeing you next week. And let us know if you have any other questions. Make sure to hit subscribe so you get notifications when we come online here. But we hope that you have a great weekend.
Yeah. Thank you. Enjoy the weather,
Okay.
everybody.
Have a good one.